The cabin lights were dimmed just enough to signal it was time to settle in, but not so dark that you couldn't see the person next to you fumbling with their seatbelt or glancing at their phone one last time. Outside, the late afternoon sun hung low over Atlanta, painting the tarmac in warm gold as the plane taxied toward the runway. Inside, the usual pre-flight hum filled the air, zippers closing, overhead bins clicking shut, the occasional cough or whispered conversation. It was a routine domestic flight, the kind people take without much thought. Atlanta to Denver, just another leg in a long week. Another step toward a relative's house, a job interview, or maybe a quiet weekend away. Near the middle of the plane, a young boy sat beside his grandmother, eyes wide with a mix of excitement and nervous energy. He was 8 years old, wearing a slightly oversized t-shirt with a cartoon rocket on it and gripping a small plastic dinosaur like it was a lifeline. This was his first time flying without his parents, and though he'd practiced what to do, how to listen to the flight attendants, where to put his tray table, when to fasten his seatbelt, he still felt like he was stepping into a dream. His grandmother, calm and steady as ever, gave his knee a reassuring pat and whispered, "You're doing great, baby," before turning to stow her carry-on. A few rows back, a man in his late 40s sat alone by the window. He hadn't spoken to anyone since boarding. His arms were crossed, his jaw tight, and he kept glancing around like he was annoyed by everything. The baby crying 3 rows up, the teenager laughing too loudly, even the way the flight attendant smiled when she asked if he wanted a drink. He'd had a rough morning, missed his original flight, and now he was stuck in a middle seat with a thin cushion and a tray table that wobbled. To him, the whole world felt like it was working against him. As the plane lifted off, the boy pressed his face to the window, watching the ground shrink away until houses looked like toys and highways turned into thin gray threads. He let out a soft "whoa," and his grandmother chuckled. When the seatbelt sign finally dinged off, he carefully unbuckled himself and reached into his backpack for his dinosaur collection. He'd brought 3, a T-Rex, a Triceratops, and a pterodactyl with one wing slightly bent. He set them on his tray table, arranging them in a careful formation like they were about to go into battle. But as he shifted to get a better angle, the T-Rex slipped from his fingers. It bounced once on the armrest and then rolled off the edge, disappearing under the seat in front of him. He leaned forward, peering down into the narrow gap between rows. "It went under," he said softly to his grandmother. "Ask nicely if you can reach for it," she reminded him. He nodded and gently tapped the seat back in front of him. The man sitting there, the same one who'd been scowling since boarding, turned slowly, his expression already sour before the boy even spoke. "Excuse me, sir," the boy said, voice polite but small. "My toy fell under your seat. Could I please reach for it?" The man didn't move right away. He stared at the boy for a beat too long, then sighed like he'd been personally inconvenienced. "Can't you wait till we land?" he muttered. "I just need a second," the boy said, already starting to slide out of his seat. "I won't touch your stuff." That's when the man's face tightened. "I said wait," he snapped, his voice louder than necessary. A few nearby passengers turned their heads. The boy froze, eyes wide. His grandmother sat up straighter, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. "It's just a toy," she said calmly, but with steel underneath. "He's not bothering anyone." The man turned fully in his seat now, glaring. Kids these days got no manners, crawling all over the place like they own it. He didn't say anything outright cruel, not yet, but the tone, the narrowed eyes, the way he leaned forward like he was ready to pounce, it all carried a weight that everyone nearby could feel. The flight attendant passing by slowed her step, watching closely. She offered a tight smile. "Everything okay here?" "Fine," the man said quickly, turning back to his window. "Just some folks don't teach their children to respect other people's space." The boy sank back into his seat, cheeks burning. His grandmother squeezed his hand under the tray table. "Ignore him," she whispered. "You did nothing wrong." But the moment had shifted something in the air. What had been a normal flight, a little noisy, a little cramped but ordinary, now carried a quiet tension. People avoided eye contact. Conversations dropped to murmurs. Even the flight attendants moved with extra care, as if afraid to stir the mood further. 20 minutes later, the boy still hadn't gotten his T-Rex back. He tried not to think about it, focusing instead on the clouds outside, imagining them as giant cotton candy mountains, but curiosity got the better of him. He glanced down again, and sure enough, the red plastic dinosaur was just barely visible under the man's seat, caught near the footrest. He waited until the man seemed absorbed in his phone, then slowly leaned into the aisle, stretching his arm down as far as he could without actually getting out of his seat. His fingers brushed the toy, almost there. That's when it happened. Without warning, the man whipped around and slapped the boy's hand. Hard. Not a tap. Not a swat. A sharp open palm smack that echoed in the quiet cabin. The boy yanked his hand back like he'd touched fire, his breath catching in his throat. For a second, no one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the whole plane had stopped breathing. Then came the gasps. "Oh my God," someone whispered. "What the hell was that?" Another voice said louder. The boy's grandmother shot to her feet. "Did you just hit my grandson?" Her voice shook, but it didn't waver. She stood tall, eyes blazing, every inch of her radiating fury and fear tangled together. The man stood too, defensive now. He was reaching under my seat. "I told him to stop." "He's a child," she shot back. "You don't hit children." "I didn't hit him, I swatted his hand." "There's a difference." But the red mark already blooming on the boy's knuckles told a different story. Tears welled in his eyes, but he didn't cry, not yet. He just stared at his hand like he couldn't believe what had happened. Two flight attendants rushed over from opposite ends of the cabin. "Sir, please sit down," one said firmly, stepping between him and the grandmother. "Ma'am, are you and your grandson okay?" Before the grandmother could answer, the man started talking again. Fast, angry, defensive. "I've had it with people letting their kids run wild. You expect me to just sit here while some brat invades my space?" That's when someone behind him muttered, "He's 8 years old." Another voice added, "And you hit him." The man spun around, looking for who'd spoken. "Mind your own business." But the damage was done. The spell of silence had broken. People weren't looking away anymore. They were watching, listening. Some had their phones out, not filming, just ready, like they knew this moment mattered. The lead flight attendant's voice cut through the rising noise. "Sir, you will return to your seat immediately. If you refuse, we will restrain you and contact authorities upon landing." The man hesitated. He looked around and saw it, the disapproval in people's eyes, the way even strangers had shifted their bodies slightly toward the boy and his grandmother, forming an unspoken circle of protection. For the first time, he seemed unsure. He sat down slowly, muttering under his breath. But the flight attendants didn't walk away. One stayed nearby, radio in hand, speaking quietly into it. The other knelt beside the boy, checking his hand, offering a cold water bottle to ease the sting. The grandmother pulled her grandson close, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "You're safe," she whispered over and over. "You're safe. I've got you." Around them, the cabin remained tense, but something else was stirring too. A quiet sense of solidarity. A woman 2 rows up handed over a pack of tissues. A man in the back nodded at the grandmother, his expression saying what words couldn't. "We see you. We're with you." No one knew yet what would happen when the plane landed. Would the man face consequences? Would the airline do the right thing? Would this moment vanish into the blur of everyday travel? Or would it stick in people's memories? But in that hour, at 35,000 feet above the earth, something real had happened. Not just an act of cruelty, but the first crack in the wall of silence that so often lets cruelty grow. And somewhere in the back of the plane, a quiet man in a leather jacket watched it all unfold. His hands clenched in his lap, his mind already made up. He hadn't planned to get involved. He'd boarded this flight wanting nothing more than to read his book and forget the week behind him. But now, as he saw the boy press his face into his grandmother's shoulder, trying not to cry, something inside him shifted. He took a slow breath and unbuckled his seatbelt. The cabin stayed quiet after the slap, but it wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the kind that comes right after something wrong happens, when everyone's holding their breath, waiting to see if someone will say something, do something, or just pretend it never happened. The air felt thick, like walking through a room full of unspoken words. The boy sat curled into his grandmother, his small frame trembling just slightly. He hadn't cried out, not loudly anyway, but his eyes were wet and he kept glancing at his hand like it didn't belong to him anymore. The red mark stood out against his skin, sharp and angry. His grandmother held him close, whispering soft words that only he could hear, her voice steady even though her hands shook. Nearby, the man who'd struck him slumped back in his seat, arms crossed again, jaw tight. He stared out the window like nothing had happened, but his foot tapped nervously against the floor. He knew he'd crossed a line. Maybe not in his own mind. He'd probably convinced himself he'd just corrected the kid, but everyone else saw it for what it was. And that made him uneasy. A flight attendant stayed close, not hovering, but present. She'd already spoken into her radio, her voice low and urgent. The captain had been notified. Protocol was being followed, but protocol doesn't always feel like enough when a child's been hurt. Then, the man muttered something under his breath, just loud enough for the row behind him to hear. "Always acting like they're entitled to everything," he said, still looking out the window. "No discipline. No respect." The words landed like stones. A woman in the aisle seat behind him stiffened. She didn't turn around, but her knuckles whitened around the armrest. 2 rows ahead, a teenager paused his music, pulling one earbud out. He'd heard it too. The grandmother didn't react right away. She kept her focus on the boy, smoothing his hair, making sure he was okay. But her eyes were sharp. She'd heard the comment, and she knew exactly what it meant. "You don't get to say things like that about him," she finally said, her voice low but clear. "Not after what you did." The man turned slowly, a smirk tugging at his lips like he thought this was some kind of game. "Oh, I'm sorry. Was I supposed to let him crawl all over me? Maybe you should have taught him better." That's when the boy flinched, not from pain this time, from shame, like he believed for just a second that it was his fault. His grandmother's voice didn't rise. "It didn't need to," he asked politely. He reached for his own toy. "He didn't touch you."
He didn't yell.
"He didn't even stand up. And you hit him." She paused, letting the truth hang in the air. "That's on you, not him. Not me. You." For a moment, the man looked like he might argue again, but then he caught the eyes of the passengers around him. People who'd been strangers 10 minutes ago, now watching him like they were seeing him for the first time. And what they saw wasn't just an angry traveler. They saw someone who'd lashed out at a child and then tried to blame him for it. He looked away, but silence didn't last. A few minutes later, as the flight attendants passed out drinks, the man flagged one down. "I'd like a whiskey," he said, voice rough. The attendant, a woman with kind eyes and silver streaks in her hair, shook her head gently. "I'm sorry, sir. We've been instructed not to serve you alcohol for the remainder of the flight." His face darkened. "On whose authority?" "The captain's," she said simply. "And honestly, it's probably for the best." He scoffed, muttering something about overreacting, but he didn't push it. Still, the rejection stung. It was the first real consequence, and it made him feel cornered. So he did what people like him often do when they feel cornered. He doubled down. As the plane leveled off and passengers started to relax again, reading, watching movies, dozing, the man leaned forward slightly and spoke again, this time louder. "You know, back in my day, kids knew their place. They didn't go sticking their hands under strangers' seats like they owned the place." No one answered him at first. Most people kept their eyes down, not wanting trouble. But then from 2 rows behind, a man in his 60s, wearing a faded baseball cap and holding a paperback, said quietly, "Back in your day, folks also thought it was okay to treat people different based on how they looked. Glad we moved past that." The comment landed like a spark in dry grass. The man whipped around. "Are you calling me racist?" The older man didn't flinch. "I'm saying a grown man doesn't slap a child for reaching for a toy, especially not after the kid said, 'Please.' And I'm saying the way you're talking now. It sounds an awful lot like you've got a problem with more than just manners." A few people nodded. Not dramatically, just small, quiet movements. But they were there, the tension climbed again. The flight attendants exchanged glances. One moved toward the cockpit to update the captain. Another stood near the galley, ready to step in if things escalated. Then the unthinkable happened. The boy, still tucked against his grandmother, whispered, "I just wanted my dinosaur." His voice was so small, so sad, that it cut through the anger like a knife. The man heard it. And for a split second, something flickered in his eyes. Maybe regret, maybe embarrassment. But instead of softening, he hardened. Because admitting he was wrong would mean admitting he'd hurt a child for no good reason. And that was too heavy to carry, so he stood up, not to apologize, not to walk away. He stood like he was going to make a point. "I'm not sitting here while people accuse me of things I didn't do," he announced, voice rising. I didn't do anything wrong. That's when the boy flinched again, this time because the man's shadow fell over him as he stepped into the aisle. The grandmother rose instantly, placing herself between them. You stay away from him, she said, voice low and fierce. The man held up his hands like he was innocent. I'm not doing anything. I'm just... But before he could finish, a voice cut through from the back of the plane. Sit down. It wasn't loud. It wasn't shouting. But it carried weight, like a command that didn't need to be repeated. Everyone turned. A man in a worn leather jacket stood in the rear galley area. He wasn't tall, but he had presence, the kind that comes from years of standing firm when others step back. His arms were at his sides, his posture relaxed but ready. He looked at the man in the aisle not with anger but with calm certainty. You've caused enough trouble, the man in the jacket said. Now sit before this gets worse for you. The man in the aisle hesitated. He looked around, expecting someone to tell the stranger to mind his business. But no one did. In fact, several passengers subtly shifted to give the man in the jacket space, like they were silently backing him up. You don't know what happened, the man snapped, trying to sound in control. I saw enough, came the reply. You hit a child. Then you blamed him. Now you're standing over him like you're owed something. You're not. The words hung in the air, clear, uncomplicated, true. The man in the aisle's face flushed. He opened his mouth to argue, but then he saw the flight attendants moving closer, their expressions serious. He saw the grandmother's eyes burning with protective fire. He saw the boy, small and quiet, looking up at him with confusion. Not fear anymore, but something worse. Disappointment. And he realized no one was on his side. Slowly, shoulders slumping, he backed into his seat and buckled his seatbelt with sharp, angry movements. He didn't look at anyone. He just stared at his hands like he was trying to pretend the last 10 minutes hadn't happened. But they had, and the cabin knew it. The man in the leather jacket didn't sit right away. He stayed standing for a few seconds, making sure the moment held. Then he gave a small nod to the grandmother, just a slight dip of his chin, and returned to his seat. As he walked back, a woman handed him a bottle of water. He took it with a quiet thanks. A teenager gave him a look that said, "That was brave." He didn't smile. He just sat down, opened his book, and pretended to read, even though his hands were still clenched. Meanwhile, the flight attendants quietly offered the boy and his grandmother new seats up front, away from the disturbance. The grandmother hesitated, then accepted. She didn't want her grandson to spend the rest of the flight feeling watched or unsafe. As they gathered their things, the boy finally picked up his backpack, and that's when he saw it. His red T-Rex lying just inside the footwell of the man's seat. The man saw it too. For a heartbeat, their eyes met. The man didn't move, didn't offer it, didn't apologize, but he didn't stop the boy from reaching down and taking it either. The boy picked up the toy slowly, fingers closing around its plastic body like it was precious, which to him it was. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say anything. He just tucked it into his pocket and walked away with his grandmother. Head held just a little higher. Back in his seat, the man who'd struck him sat alone, surrounded by strangers who now saw him for exactly who he was. No one spoke to him. No one looked at him. He was invisible in the worst way, not because he was ignored, but because he'd shown his true self and no one wanted to be near it. Up front, the boy sat in his new window seat, dinosaur in hand. His grandmother held his uninjured hand tightly. Outside, the sky stretched endlessly, blue, calm, untouched by what had happened inside the metal tube flying through it. But inside, something had changed. The silence now wasn't tense. It was watchful, protective, like the whole cabin had decided without saying a word, that they wouldn't let anything else happen to that child. And in the back, the man in the leather jacket finally turned a page in his book, though he hadn't read a single word. He was thinking about his own nephew, about how the world still wasn't kind enough, and about how sometimes all it takes is one person standing up to remind everyone else that they can too. The plane hummed on, carrying its passengers toward Denver, toward consequences, toward healing, toward stories they'd tell for years, and none of them knew it yet. But the real turning point hadn't been the slap. It had been the moment someone chose not to look away. The plane settled into a steady rhythm again, the kind of calm that follows a storm. Not because the danger is gone, but because everyone's bracing for what comes next. Up front, the boy sat quietly by the window, his red dinosaur resting in his lap like a silent promise that things could still be okay. His grandmother kept one hand on his shoulder, her thumb moving in slow circles, a quiet rhythm of comfort. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. He knew he was safe now. But back in the middle of the cabin, the air still felt charged. The man who'd struck the boy sat stiffly in his seat, eyes fixed on the seat back in front of him, as if staring hard enough might erase what he'd done. He hadn't spoken since returning to his seat. He hadn't even touched the airline blanket folded neatly in the pouch. He just sat there, wrapped in a silence that felt more like shame than peace. And then, without warning, he stood again, not aggressively this time, more like someone trying to convince himself he still had control. He turned toward the galley, muttering something about needing water. But the moment he stepped into the aisle, three things happened at once. First, the lead flight attendant stepped directly in his path, arms loose but posture firm. "Sir," she said, voice calm but leaving no room for debate, "please remain seated for the rest of the flight unless it's an emergency." Second, the man in the leather jacket who'd been pretending to read his book looked up slowly. He didn't stand. He didn't say a word, but his eyes locked onto the man's, steady and unblinking. It was enough. Third, and this was the part no one expected, a woman 2 rows behind stood up too. She wasn't loud. She wasn't dramatic. She just rose from her seat, adjusted her sweater, and moved to stand near the front of the cabin, close enough to the boy and his grandmother that her presence felt like a shield. That small act sparked something. From the other side of the plane, a man in a nurse's scrubs off-duty heading home after a double shift stood as well. He didn't approach anyone. He just unbuckled, stretched like it was casual, and leaned against the bulkhead near the restroom, arms crossed. But everyone knew he wasn't just stretching. He was watching. Then, from near the emergency exit, a retired schoolteacher, gray hair in a neat bun, reading glasses perched on her nose, closed her book and stood. She walked calmly to the empty seat across from the boy and his grandmother and asked, "Mind if I sit here?" Her voice was warm, but her eyes scanned the cabin like she was ready to step in if needed. Within 30 seconds, 4 strangers had positioned themselves not in a circle, not in a show of force, but in quiet alignment. They weren't blocking aisles or making demands. They were simply present, visible, willing. And that changed everything. The man who'd stood up for water froze in the aisle. He looked around, and for the first time he saw it. Not just disapproval, but unity. These weren't random passengers anymore. They were a group. Not because they knew each other, but because they'd chosen the same side, the side of decency. He swallowed hard. "I just wanted water," he said, his voice smaller now. The flight attendant didn't move. "I'll bring you a cup when it's appropriate, sir. For now, please sit." He hesitated, glanced back at his seat. Then, defeated, he turned and walked back, shoulders slumped. This time, when he sat, he pulled the shade down over his window, shutting out the world, and maybe, for a moment, himself. Up front, the boy watched it all from the corner of his eye. He didn't understand everything that was happening, but he understood this. People were standing up for him. Not because they knew him, not because they owed him anything, just because it was right. He turned to his grandmother and whispered, "Why are they doing that?" She smiled softly. "Because good people don't let bad things happen when they can stop them." He thought about that for a moment, then looked down at his dinosaur. "I want to be like that when I grow up." Her eyes glistened, but she nodded. "You already are, baby." Meanwhile, in the back, the man in the leather jacket finally closed his book. He hadn't read a page. His mind had been racing since the slap, remembering his own childhood, the times he'd stayed silent when he should have spoken up, the faces of kids he'd failed to protect as a counselor. He'd spent years teaching students about courage, about doing the right thing even when it's hard. And today, on a crowded plane, he'd finally lived it. He caught the eye of the nurse and gave a small nod. The nurse nodded back. No words needed. They both knew this wasn't over. Not until the plane landed. Not until someone held that man accountable. A few minutes later, the captain's voice came over the intercom, calm, professional, but with an edge. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a minor cabin disturbance. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We've alerted Denver authorities, and law enforcement will meet us at the gate upon arrival. Thank you for your cooperation. A ripple went through the cabin. Some passengers exchanged worried glances. Others sat up straighter, like they'd been waiting for this moment. The message was clear. This wouldn't be swept under the rug. The man in the middle seat heard it too. His hands gripped the armrest so tightly his knuckles turned white. He'd probably thought it would end with an apology, a scolding, maybe a seat change. But police charges? That hadn't been part of the plan. He turned slightly as if to say something, but no one looked at him. Not the flight attendants. Not the passengers. Even the person in the seat next to him had put on headphones and turned toward the window, creating a wall of polite indifference. Isolation settled over him like a heavy coat. Back up front, the retired teacher leaned toward the grandmother and said gently, "My classroom had a rule. If someone's being unkind, you don't have to fight them, but you do have to stand with the person being hurt." She smiled. Looks like this whole plane remembered that rule today. The grandmother reached over and squeezed her hand. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more than words could carry. Time passed. The sun dipped lower outside, casting long shadows across the clouds. Dinner trays came and went. The boy ate his pasta quietly, his appetite returning now that the fear had lifted. He even showed his dinosaur to the teacher, who admired its chipped paint and bent tail like it was a museum piece. But the real story wasn't in the front, it was in the quiet shifts happening all around. A teenager who'd been scrolling through his phone since takeoff put it away and sat up straight, watching the middle of the cabin like a sentry. A couple who'd been arguing about vacation plans earlier now sat side by side, hands linked, their earlier tension replaced by shared resolve. Even the flight attendants moved with a new kind of purpose, not just serving drinks, but checking in, making eye contact, silently reinforcing that the cabin was under their protection. And then, something small but powerful happened. The man who'd hit the boy reached into his carry-on and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He stared at it for a long time, maybe a photo, maybe a letter. His shoulders shook just slightly. He didn't cry, but his breath hitched like he was fighting something inside. No one went to him. No one offered comfort. And that was the point. Kindness isn't just about helping. It's also about letting people sit with the weight of their choices. But even in that moment of isolation, there was grace. The flight attendant brought him a cup of water. No comment, no glare. Just water. Because even those who do wrong are still human, and humanity at its best holds people accountable without dehumanizing them. As the plane began its descent into Denver, the captain came on again. "We'll be landing in approximately 20 minutes. Law enforcement will be waiting at gate B12. Please remain in your seats until instructed otherwise." A hush fell over the cabin. Not fear, readiness. The man in the leather jacket stood again, not to confront, but to prepare. He zipped his jacket, checked his phone, and took a deep breath. He knew what came next. Statements, questions, maybe even a courtroom. But he also knew he'd do it all over again. The nurse walked over and stood beside him. "You handled that well," she said quietly. "I just said what needed saying," he replied. "Sometimes that's the hardest part," she said, saying it first. Behind them, the retired teacher gathered her things. The boy looked up at her. "Are you leaving?" "Soon," she said, smiling. "But I'll be right here until the very end." He nodded, then turned to his grandmother. "Do you think he'll get in trouble?" She didn't sugarcoat it. "I hope so. Not to hurt him, but so he learns that hurting others has consequences." The boy thought about that. Then he said, "I hope he learns to be kind." And in that moment, everyone who heard him felt something shift, not just in the story, but in themselves. Because the real victory wasn't just that a man was stopped. It was that a child still believed in kindness. As the wheels touched down in Denver and the plane rolled toward the gate, the cabin stayed quiet. No one stood. No one rushed. They waited, united by something they hadn't planned, hadn't expected, but now carried together. Outside, the night air was cool. Inside, something warm had taken root. And when the door finally opened and police officers stepped aboard, faces serious but calm, the passengers didn't scatter. They stayed seated. They watched. They bore witness. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to look away. The moment the aircraft door opened, the air inside the cabin changed. It wasn't just cooler. It felt heavier, charged with the kind of quiet seriousness that comes when real life steps in. 2 police officers boarded first, calm but alert, their uniforms crisp under the cabin lights. They moved with purpose, not urgency, scanning the rows until a flight attendant pointed toward the middle of the plane. The man who'd struck the boy didn't resist. He didn't argue or raise his voice. He simply stood when asked, zipped his jacket with slow, deliberate movements, and walked down the aisle with his hands at his sides. But his eyes stayed fixed on the floor. He didn't look at the boy. He didn't look at the grandmother. He didn't even glance at the strangers who'd stood up for them. It was as if he couldn't bear to see the faces of the people who'd witnessed what he'd become in that moment of anger. Outside, the jet bridge hummed softly, and beyond it, the Denver airport buzzed with the usual late evening rhythm. Travelers dragging suitcases, families reuniting, announcements echoing over the intercom. But for those still on the plane, time seemed to slow. The officers led the man off first, followed by 2 airline security personnel. Then came the requests. Anyone who'd seen the incident was asked to stay behind briefly to give a statement. The flight attendants handed out contact cards and explained the process gently, making it clear no one was being forced, but if they were willing to speak up, it would help. One by one, people raised their hands. The man in the leather jacket was first. He stepped into the jet bridge without hesitation. Standing tall as an officer asked him what he'd seen. He spoke clearly, without exaggeration. The boy reached for his toy. The man slapped his hand hard enough to leave a mark. Then he made comments that felt racially charged. I stood because it was wrong, and because no child should feel unsafe on a plane. The nurse came next. She described the boy's reaction, the flinch, the silence, the way he'd tried not to cry. I've seen trauma before, she said quietly. That wasn't just surprise. It was fear. The retired teacher spoke last. Her voice was steady, her words precise. He didn't just hit the child. He tried to justify it by implying the boy didn't know his place. That's not discipline. That's bias. Even the teenager who'd been listening to music gave a statement. I heard him say stuff after, he admitted. It wasn't just about the toy. It felt personal. Meanwhile, the boy and his grandmother were escorted to a quiet area near the gate by a customer service representative. They weren't treated like witnesses. They were treated like people who'd been hurt. Warm drinks were brought. Blankets offered. A counselor from the airline support team arrived within 20 minutes, kneeling to speak to the boy at eye level, asking gentle questions, offering reassurance. The boy didn't say much at first, but when the counselor asked if he wanted to keep his dinosaur, he nodded fiercely and clutched it tighter. He protects me, he said softly. The grandmother watched him, her heart aching and swelling at the same time. She'd been terrified on that plane, not just for his safety, but for his spirit. Would this moment make him smaller? Would he start believing the world wasn't safe for him? But now, seeing the way strangers had rallied, the way the airline was responding, not with deflection, but with care, she felt a flicker of hope. Back at the gate, the man in the leather jacket finished his statement and turned to leave. But before he could walk away, the grandmother approached him. She didn't hug him. She didn't gush. She just looked him in the eyes and said, "Thank you for seeing him." "For seeing us," he nodded, his throat tight. "Anyone would have done it." "No," she said gently. "Not anyone. But you did." He didn't know what to say to that, so he just said, "I'm glad he's okay." They stood there for a moment in silence. 2 strangers bound by a single choice, one to harm and one to protect. Later that night, news of the incident began to spread, but not in the way these things often do. There were no shaky cell phone videos, no edited clips designed to inflame. Instead, a few passengers shared their accounts with local reporters, focusing not on the violence but on the response. Headlines read, "Passengers unite to protect child after mid-flight altercation," and "Airline confirms legal action following in-flight assault." The man faced charges, misdemeanor assault, disorderly conduct, and a federal violation for interfering with a flight crew's duties by creating a disturbance. His mugshot appeared online, but the story wasn't about him. It was about the quiet courage of ordinary people who chose, in real time, to do what was right. The next morning, the boy and his grandmother were rebooked on a new flight, at no cost, and given first-class seats as a gesture of apology. But more than that, they were given dignity. The airline's CEO called personally to express regret and outline new steps they were taking. Mandatory anti-bias training for crew, clearer protocols for handling in-flight harassment, and a partnership with a national organization that supports children who experience public trauma. The boy didn't care about the upgrades or the headlines. What stayed with him was the way the retired teacher had smiled at him before they parted ways. How the nurse had winked and said, "You're braver than you know." How the man in the leather jacket had given him a small, folded piece of paper before boarding his own connecting flight. On it, he'd written, "Kindness is a superpower. Never stop using it." Back home, the boy taped that note to his bedroom wall right above his bed. Every night before sleep, he read it. And every morning he woke up a little less afraid. As for the man who'd hit him, he posted bail the next day. His lawyer argued it was a misunderstanding, that he'd reacted instinctively to feeling invaded. But the statements from passengers, the red mark on the boy's hand, the audio from the flight's internal comms, all of it painted a clear picture. His case wouldn't go to trial for months, but already, his employer had placed him on leave. Friends stopped returning his calls. Even his own family struggled to defend what he'd done. He'd expected outrage on his behalf. Instead, he found silence, and in that silence, maybe, he began to understand. Weeks later, the man in the leather jacket returned to his job as a high school counselor. He didn't tell his students about the flight at first, but when a group of kids came to him worried about standing up to a bully, he shared a version of the story, without names, without drama, just the truth. Sometimes all it takes is one person saying, "This isn't okay," to give everyone else permission to do the same. The nurse went back to her hospital, but she started volunteering with a youth mentorship program on her days off. "If I can help one kid feel seen," she told a colleague, "it's worth it." The retired teacher wrote a letter to the airline not to complain, but to thank them for taking the incident seriously. She also sent a children's book about courage to the boy's home, no return address, just a note, for the young hero who kept his heart open. And the boy? He started school again the following week. On the first day, when a classmate made a rude comment about his skin, he didn't shrink. He looked the kid in the eye and said, "That's not how we treat people." Then he walked away, not in anger, but in peace. His grandmother watched from the school gate, tears in her eyes, not from sadness, but pride, because what happened on that plane could have broken him. Instead, it showed him that goodness is real, and that it often shows up in the most ordinary people. At the most unexpected times, the legal process would continue. The man would face consequences. The airline would update its policies. But none of that was the heart of the story. The heart was in the moment a child reached for his toy, and a cabin full of strangers chose to reach for each other. And in the end, that's what changed everything. Months passed, and the sharp edges of that mid-flight moment began to soften, not because it was forgotten, but because it had settled into something deeper. It wasn't just a story people told. It became a quiet reference point, a reminder that ordinary choices can ripple outward in ways no one expects. The boy was now 9. He still carried his red dinosaur in his backpack, though its paint had faded and one leg was held on with a dab of glue. He didn't play with it as much anymore, but he kept it close like a talisman, not because it reminded him of fear, but because it reminded him of what came after. The strangers who stood, the voices that rose, the hands that reached out without being asked. At school, he'd started speaking up more, not loudly, not aggressively, but with a calm certainty that surprised even his teachers. When a new student was laughed at for his accent, the boy sat with him at lunch. When someone made a joke that felt off, he'd say, "That's not funny," and walk away. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was just living the lesson he'd learned at 35,000 feet, that kindness isn't passive. It's something you do even when it's quiet. His grandmother watched these changes with a mix of awe and relief. She'd worried that day on the plane would leave a scar. Instead, it had planted a seed. One night, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies blink in the summer dusk, she asked him, "Do you ever think about that man?" He was quiet for a long time, swirling his juice box straw. Then he said, "I hope he's sorry, not angry, not vengeful, just hopeful." That was the moment she knew he'd be okay, not just safe, but whole. Meanwhile, the airline had followed through on its promises. Within 3 months, every crew member had completed new training, focused on recognizing and responding to bias-based incidents, not just racism, but any behavior that made passengers feel targeted or unsafe. Flight attendants were now empowered to de-escalate, document, and, when necessary, request immediate intervention. The program wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it had started because one child's pain had been seen, not ignored. The man in the leather jacket received an unexpected email one afternoon. It was from the airline's community outreach team. They'd heard about his actions, not from news reports but from the flight crew, and wanted to invite him to help design a bystander intervention module for their new training. He almost declined. He didn't want attention, but then he thought about the kids he worked with, the ones who stayed silent because they didn't know how to speak up, and he said yes. He didn't talk about himself in the sessions. Instead, he told stories about moments when doing nothing hurt more than stepping in. He taught flight attendants how to read body language, how to create space for victims, how to use calm authority instead of confrontation. And every time he spoke, he ended with the same line: "You don't have to be loud to be brave. You just have to choose." The retired teacher, back in her quiet neighborhood, started hosting monthly courage circles at the local library. Small gatherings where people shared stories of times they stood up or wished they had. It wasn't therapy. It wasn't activism. It was just humans talking honestly about the weight of doing the right thing. Attendance grew slowly, then steadily. Teenagers came. Parents, even a few airline employees. They didn't solve the world's problems in those rooms, but they reminded each other they weren't alone. As for the man who'd struck the boy, he never went to trial. His lawyer negotiated a plea deal: community service, anger management counseling, and a permanent ban from the airline. He disappeared from the headlines as quickly as he'd appeared. But months later, a plain envelope arrived at the boy's home. No return address. Inside was a handwritten note on simple lined paper. It read, "I was wrong. I hurt a child because I was angry at the world, and that's no excuse. I'm working to be better. I hope you're okay." The grandmother showed it to the boy. He read it twice, then folded it carefully and put it in his desk drawer, next to the note from the man in the leather jacket. "He's trying," the boy said simply. His grandmother didn't know whether to trust the apology, but she trusted her grandson's heart. And if he could find room for hope, maybe that was enough. One crisp autumn morning, the high school where the man in the leather jacket worked hosted a special assembly. Not about grades or rules, but about everyday courage. Students filed into the auditorium, some yawning, some chatting, most expecting another boring talk. But then the counselor walked on stage and played a short, anonymized audio clip, just voices from a plane, edited to protect identities. A child's soft voice asking for his toy, a sharp slap, a woman's furious defense, and then a calm command: "Sit down." The room fell silent. He didn't name names. He didn't dramatize. He just asked, "What would you have done?" Afterward, dozens of students stayed behind. One girl, eyes wide, said, "I would have frozen." "I always do," he nodded. "That's normal. But freezing doesn't have to be the end of the story. You can act a second later, a minute later, even a day later. Courage isn't about being fearless. It's about choosing to care more than you fear. That week, 3 students reported bullying they'd witnessed for weeks, not for praise, but because they finally believed someone would listen. Back in Denver, the boys' school invited the retired teacher to speak at a parent-teacher night. She didn't give a speech. She just sat in a circle with parents and asked, "When was the last time you stood up for someone who wasn't your own?" The conversation lasted 2 hours. No one had all the answers, but everyone left feeling a little less alone. And then, on a quiet evening in late October, the grandmother sat at her kitchen table with a stack of thank you cards. She'd been writing them for weeks. One for the nurse, one for the teacher, one for the flight attendant who'd stayed close, and a longer one for the man in the leather jacket. She didn't expect replies. She just wanted them to know their actions mattered. She sealed the last envelope, pressed a stamp on it, and set it aside. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, sending golden leaves skittering across the driveway. Inside, the house was warm, filled with the smell of soup simmering on the stove and the soft sound of her grandson reading aloud to his little cousin. She thought about how close it had been. That moment on the plane when everything could have gone sideways. One more second of silence, one more person looking away, and the story might have ended differently. But it didn't, because people chose in real time to be each other's keepers. That's what stayed with her, not the slap but the standing up, not the cruelty, but the care that followed. A few days later, a small package arrived for the boy. Inside was a brand new plastic dinosaur, same kind, same red color, but with all its limbs intact. Tucked in the box was a note from the airline's CEO, for the young traveler who reminded us all what really matters. The boy held it for a long time. Then he placed it on his shelf, not to replace the old one, but to stand beside it, a symbol of what was broken and what was rebuilt. Years from now, people might forget the details of that flight. They might not remember the man's face or the exact words that were said. But those who were there, the passengers, the crew, the boy and his grandmother, would carry it with them, not as a wound, but as a compass. Because the truth is, the world doesn't change in grand, sweeping moments. It changes in small ones, a hand reaching under a seat, a voice saying enough, a stranger choosing to stand when it would have been easier to stay seated. And sometimes, all it takes is one act of decency, simple, human, unscripted, to remind us that we're still capable of good. On that plane, no one set out to be a hero. They just refused to let a child feel alone, and in the end, that was everything.